she said. "You keep staring at that corner of the yard, like it owes you money." I laughed, because the alternative was telling a woman I'd met 6 days ago that my father built that stone wall with me the summer before he got sick, that I could still feel the weight of the rocks in my hands, that every time I knelt in her garden, I was kneeling in mine. My name is Caleb. I'm 32, and I'm a landscaper, and the woman who just called me out is the reason I can't stop coming back to a house I should have let go of a long time ago. I need to back up. The referral came through my business partner, Danny. Client named Nora Ashland, veterinarian, new to the area. Wanted a full redesign of a residential property on Bellwick Road. Overgrown yard, neglected beds, the whole thing. Danny took the call because I was on-site finishing a drainage project in Ridgemont. He texted me the address and said she sounded reasonable, which in Danny's vocabulary meant she hadn't argued about the deposit. I didn't look at the address until the next morning. I was sitting in my truck outside a hardware store, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. 214 Bellwick Road. I read it twice before my hands went still. The coffee cooled while I sat there staring at a screen like it had made a mistake. But addresses don't make mistakes. People do. That was my parents' house. The house where I grew up. The house my mother sold 14 months after my father died because she said the garden made her cry and the kitchen still smelled like him in the mornings. She moved to a condo near my sister in Raleigh, a small place with no yard and no reason to own gardening gloves. I helped carry the boxes. I didn't go back. My father's name was David Marsh. He was a quiet man who fixed things for a living and fixed things at home for free because he didn't know how to sit down. He died at 54, which is the kind of age that sounds old when you're 14 and sounds young when you're 32. 3 years. I hadn't driven down Bellwick Road in 3 years. Not on purpose, not by accident. It sat in a part of town I had quietly removed from my roots, like a street my GPS learned to avoid without being told. And now, a stranger wanted me to redesign its yard. I should have handed it off to Danny. He would have taken it. He takes everything. The man once agreed to a landscaping job for a woman who wanted her entire backyard labyrinth converted into the munds from rivers in her home county. Danny drove 4 hours each way for rocks. He would not have blinked. Each way for rocks. He would not have blinked at 214 Bellwick. I could have called him right there in the parking lot. Told him the address was complicated, and let him take the walkthrough. Danny doesn't ask personal questions. He would have nodded and moved on, and I would have gone back to the drainage project in Ridgemont and never thought about Bellwick Road again. But I didn't call him. I put the truck in gear and drove there myself. The street looked smaller than I remembered. That happens with places you leave at 19. The trees had filled in along the sidewalk, thick and careless, branches almost touching over the road. The houses sat the same, brick, clapboard, wide porches. The Garcias still had that ceramic rooster by their mailbox, faded now to something between orange and regret. Then I saw the house. Someone had painted the front door green. My mother's door was always red. That was the first thing. The porch railing had been replaced with something more modern, thinner, metal instead of wood. The shutters were new, but the bones were the same. the shape of the roof. The way the front walk curved slightly left before the steps, a mistake in the original pour that my father refused to fix because he said it gave the house personality. I parked across the street and sat in my truck for longer than I should have. The engine was running and I had both hands on the steering wheel like I might change my mind. I didn't change my mind. A woman came out the side door. She wore a gray pullover and jeans, hair pulled back with a clip that was losing the fight. She had a phone pressed between her shoulder and her ear, and she was writing something on a clipboard balanced on her knee while sitting on the porch steps. That was Nora. She saw the truck, waved once like she'd been expecting me, held up one finger, mouthed sorry. Then she kept talking into the phone, her voice carrying just enough for me to catch fragments. Dosage. Overnight. I'll call the family in an hour. I got out and started walking the property line while she finished. I told myself I was doing an initial assessment. That was partly true. But my feet knew where they were going before my brain gave permission. The backyard was worse than I expected. 3 years of neglect, plus a new owner who hadn't touched it yet. The boxwoods along the east side had gone feral, swallowing the fence line whole. The flower beds were buried under creeping Charlie and dead leaves from 2 autumns. The lawn was patchy, more moss than grass, near the north corner, where the old walnut tree blocked the sun, and the stone wall. It sat along the back left corner of the property, maybe 40 feet long, 3 feet high. Fieldstone, dry stacked, no mortar. The kind of wall that looks simple until you try to build one and realize every stone has to be chosen for the one below it and the one beside it. It takes patience. My father had a lot of that. We built it the summer I was 14. He was 51. He'd wanted a stone wall since before I was born, he told me. But there was always something else first. Roof repairs, my braces, a new water heater that couldn't wait another winter. The wall kept getting pushed to next year. Then one June, he came home with a truck full of fieldstone from a farm outside Dalton and said, "This summer we build." It took us 9 weekends. My hands blistered, healed, blistered again. He showed me how to read the stones, how to find the flat face, how to set each one so gravity did the work instead of mortar. We didn't talk much while we worked. That was his way. Silence wasn't cold with my father. It was just the sound of 2 people doing something together that didn't need explaining. The wall was still standing. A few stones had shifted near the far end, and moss had claimed the top course like it owned the place. But the wall held. 18 years, and it held. I was crouched beside it, running my hand along the base course, when Nora came around the corner. She stopped a few feet away, clipboard under one arm now, phone in her back pocket. She had a direct way of standing, feet planted, shoulders square, like someone used to making decisions in rooms where hesitation cost something. Sorry about that. Emergency intake. Parvo case, 8-month-old shepherd mix. The owners waited too long. Her voice was warm, but matter-of-fact. She didn't perform the apology. She just delivered it and moved on. I liked that. I didn't realize I liked it until later, but I did. No problem. She looked past me at the yard and let out a slow breath. So, this is the situation. We walked the property together. She talked about what she wanted, while I cataloged what she didn't know she had. The boxwoods needed to go, she said. They blocked the light and made the yard feel like a tunnel. She was right about that. She wanted native perennials. Coneflower, black-eyed Susan, maybe some wild bergamot if the soil was right. She wanted the back beds opened up and the fence line cleared so the yard could breathe. I listened and nodded. I took notes on my phone and measurements with a tape. Professional things, normal things. But every few steps, something snagged. The patch along the south fence, where my mother's vegetable garden used to be. I could still see the shape of it if I looked at the ground the right way. The rows ran east to west, because my father said tomatoes wanted morning sun. The soil there was darker than anywhere else in the yard. Decades of compost and amendment that no amount of neglect could undo. Nora walked right over it without looking down. She had no reason to. For her, it was just soil. For me, it was the place where my mother used to kneel in the evenings and talk to her tomato plants like they understood her, and the maple. A sugar maple near the center of the yard, 20 feet tall now, full and symmetrical. My parents planted it the spring I was born. There's a photo somewhere of my mother holding me next to a sapling barely taller than she was. That tree was supposed to grow up with me. It did. I just stopped showing up. Nora pointed at the stone wall. What do you want to do with that? I looked at the wall, and the question was simple, but the answer wasn't. Not even close. That wall was the last project my father finished before the diagnosis. The following October, he started losing weight. By Christmas, he was in treatment. He never touched the yard again. My mother maintained it for the first year, then let it go slowly, bed by bed, like she was releasing pieces of him in order. The wall was the last thing she kept clean. Even after she listed the house, she went back once, with a wire brush, and cleared the moss from the top stones. She told me that later, on the phone, like it was nothing. I had to clean up David's wall before the showing. It took 2 hours. I stood there with Nora, looking at me, waiting for an answer. She had her pen resting against the clipboard, and her head tilted slightly to one side, patient, like she was used to giving animals and people the same courtesy of time. I'd keep it, I said. Her eyebrows lifted a fraction, and she tilted her head the other way. Like I'd said something she hadn't expected. Really, it doesn't match anything I'm planning. Fieldstone walls age well. That one's dry stacked, so it drains itself. You put a perennial border along the base, some creeping phlox, maybe catmint, and it becomes a feature instead of a leftover. She turned back to the wall and studied it for a while. I watched her eyes move along the top course, the way you'd read a sentence, left to right, looking for something. She nodded slowly. Okay, I trust you on that. She had no reason to trust me. We'd met 12 minutes ago. But she said it like trust was a thing she gave easily and took back rarely, which was the opposite of how I worked. We finished the walkthrough near the side gate. Nora leaned against the fence post and crossed her arms, not defensive, comfortable. The late afternoon light caught the side of her face, and I noticed she had a small scar above her left eyebrow. A thin line, old, almost invisible, unless the light hit it at that exact angle. So how long have you been doing this? She asked. Landscaping? About 10 years, though only 8 of those were professional. She smiled. What were the other 2? unprofessional landscaping, mostly my parents' yard. That got a real laugh from her. Brief, surprised, like she hadn't expected to laugh at a landscaping joke. Fair enough. I hadn't expected to make one, not here. I asked about her timeline. She'd moved from Philadelphia 3 months ago, took over a small animal clinic on the east side of town that had been looking for a new vet after the previous one retired. She said Philadelphia like someone putting down a heavy bag. Not angry. Relieved. Needed a change, she said. Then she caught herself and added, "That's the boring version." The interesting version involves a failed engagement, a very loud argument in an IKEA parking lot, and the realization that I was 35 years old and living someone else's plan. She said it with a half smile. Testing whether I could handle honesty served casually. Some people drop personal details like that as a dare. Nora dropped them like loose change. Here, take it or don't. Either way, I'm not picking it back up. IKEA parking lots will do that, I said. She studied me for a second, her eyes narrowing just slightly, like she was recalibrating something. Then she uncrossed her arms and pulled her keys from her jacket pocket. "I'll email you the details tonight. The beds, the measurements, whatever you need. I want to start as soon as the ground is ready." Early spring. The yard was bare. The soil still half frozen in the mornings, soft by noon. That liminal season when everything looks dead but isn't, just waiting for someone to pay attention. I loaded my gear into the truck. Tape measure, soil probe, the notebook I'd barely used because I'd spent the whole walkthrough remembering instead of measuring. Nora stood on the porch steps watching me, not in a guarded way, in the way someone watches a person they've decided to pay attention to. "Caleb." I looked up. She had one hand on the doorframe. The late light behind her made the green door glow. "I'm glad you kept the wall. Any other landscaper would have told me to tear it out and start fresh." I closed the tailgate. She was already turning to go inside when she added, over her shoulder, "Casual as anything. Same time Thursday works for me if it works for you." The door closed. I sat in the truck with the engine running and the street going quiet around me. I could see the stone wall from where I was parked, just the top course visible over the fence line, the moss catching the last of the day's light. My father's stones, still holding after all this time. I should call Danny. Tell him I couldn't take this one. Tell him the address was complicated, and that the walkthrough had felt like stepping back into a room I'd spent 3 years learning to leave. He'd understand without asking. Danny was good like that. I picked up my phone and opened his contact. His name sat there on the screen, one tap away from the right decision. I put the phone down and drove home. The next morning I pulled up Danny's estimate template and started building the proposal for 214 Bellwick. Square footage, soil amendments, plant list, labor hours. Normal work, I told myself. It was normal work. The cursor blinked at the top of the spreadsheet, where it asked for the client name, and I typed Asland, Nora, and saved the file, and didn't think about the green door, or the way she'd said, "I'm glad you kept the wall," like she was glad about something much larger than a wall. Tuesday came fast. I arrived at 8 with a truckload of composted topsoil and a plan for the east beds. Nora was already gone for the day. A note on the side door, written on the back of a veterinary supply receipt. Key under the ceramic pot if you need the hose. Help yourself to the coffee maker. It's the good stuff. The coffee maker was a pour-over setup on the kitchen counter, which I only discovered after letting myself in to connect the garden hose. The kitchen smelled like cardboard and cinnamon. Moving boxes still lined one wall, labeled in neat handwriting. Office, then books. Heavy, then more books. Heavier. She'd been here 3 months and hadn't finished unpacking. I liked that about her before I caught myself liking things about her. I worked the east beds until noon, pulled the old boxwoods, opened up the fence line, turned the soil. The work was good. Physical enough to keep my head quiet. Except the quiet never lasted. Every time I knelt in that yard, a different piece of the old place surfaced. The texture of the soil near the south fence. The angle of the afternoon light hitting the stone wall. Muscle memory moved through my hands before thought could catch it. I'd reach for a tool at my left hip, the way my father carried his, and then I'd remember where I was and when. Nora came home around 4. I heard the car first, then the side gate, then a sound I hadn't expected. She was talking to a cat, not in a baby voice. In a conversational tone like the cat had asked her a reasonable question, and she was giving it a considered answer. Gerald, I've told you twice this week. The Hendersons feed you plenty. You don't need to audition at every house on the block. The cat, a gray tabby, with an ear that bent sideways like it had lost an argument, followed her across the yard. Nora stopped when she saw me near the fence line, dirt up to my elbows, sweat through my shirt. You've been here since 8? I shrugged. The boxwoods put up a fight. She looked at the cleared fence line and her shoulders dropped a fraction, like something unclenched. The yard already looks bigger, she said. Then she looked at the coffee maker through the kitchen window. Did you at least use the pour-over? I didn't. I brought my own. Her face did something complicated. Offense, amusement, challenge. She disappeared inside and came out 4 minutes later with a mug. Try this. The coffee was better than mine. Significantly better. I didn't tell her that. It's fine, I said. She narrowed her eyes. That's exactly what someone would say about bad coffee to be polite. That's also what someone would say about fine coffee because it's fine. She tilted her head and studied me for a beat, then took the mug back. Thursday, I'll make it stronger. You'll break. I came back Thursday. She left a mug on the porch railing with a note. Round 2. The coffee was darker this time, almost aggressive. I drank it and left the empty mug on the railing where I'd found it. I didn't leave a note. But I came back Tuesday, and the mug was there again. This pattern assembled itself over 3 weeks, without either of us naming it. I showed up Tuesdays and Thursdays. She left before I arrived most mornings and came home in the late afternoon, still in her clinic scrubs, blue-green fabric with the occasional smear of something I chose not to investigate. The coffee evolved. She made it too sweet the second week, and I drank it anyway and said nothing, and on Thursday of that week, the sugar was gone, and a folded note sat under the mug that read I knew it. She was paying attention. Not in a watching way, but in a noticing way, and the distinction mattered. The second week she came home early on a Thursday and found me near the stone wall. not working on it, just standing beside it with one hand on the top course, looking at nothing in particular. I didn't hear her come through the gate. "You do that a lot," she said. "Do what?" "Stop near the wall, not to work on it, just to stand there." I pulled my hand back and wiped it on my jeans. "Fieldstone's a good gauge for drainage patterns," I told her. "The moss tells you where the moisture collects." She nodded. Maybe she believed it. Maybe she was being kind enough to let me believe she believed it. Either way, she changed the subject. Gerald ate something he shouldn't have. I spent 20 minutes this morning examining a cat who looked at me like I was the problem. Is Gerald a patient or a friend at this point? She thought about it. Frenemy. He shows up when he wants affection and disappears when I need him to hold still for an ear exam. So, basically every man I've ever met. I laughed before I could stop it. The sound came from somewhere unguarded, and I watched her register it, that small shift in her expression. Like she'd found a frequency she'd been scanning for. By week 3, the garden was taking shape. The east beds were planted with native perennials, the way she wanted. Cone flower and black-eyed Susan along the fence, wild bergamot in the middle bed, where the afternoon sun hit longest. The south border was cleared and turned, ready for the next phase. The yard looked wider, brighter. Air moved through it differently now. And in the middle of that third week, on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was resetting pavers near the back gate, my phone rang. Mom. I picked up with dirty hands and a pulse that jumped the way it does. Someone calls when someone calls who doesn't usually call on Tuesdays. Hey. Her voice was warm and careful. The careful part was new. Or maybe I'd just stopped noticing it. Where are you? You sound outside. Working. On a Tuesday. I thought Tuesdays were your admin days. Danny does the site work mid-week. You told me that in January. My mother remembered everything I told her, and most of what I didn't. It was a skill that made lying to her a spectacularly losing game. She had spent 31 years married to a quiet man and had learned to decode silence the way other people decode speech. I picked up an extra project, residential redesign, full yard. Where? I could have said anything. West Side, or out past Ridgemont, or near the high school. Any answer that wasn't Bellwick Road. She would have accepted any of them and moved on to asking whether I was eating enough and whether Danny's wife had the baby yet. Bellwick, I said. The line went quiet. Not the quiet of a dropped signal. The quiet of a woman holding her breath on purpose. 2:14. Yeah. She exhaled, a controlled sound. Measured the kind of breath you take in a doorway before deciding whether to walk through it. Caleb, I know. You know what? I know what you're going to say. No, you don't. Because what I'm going to say is be careful. And you think, I mean be careful with the house, but I don't. That house is just wood and stone. I mean be careful with whatever you're looking for in that yard. Because your father left things there that neither of us finished grieving, and I don't want you to confuse tending a garden with tending a wound. If you're still here with me, and you want more stories like this one, the channel has plenty. More waiting for you. My mother had a way of saying the exact thing you weren't ready to hear in the exact tone that made it impossible to argue. She learned it from my father, who never argued with anyone, because he just stated facts and let gravity do the rest. The way you build a wall. I'm just landscaping, Mom. She said okay, but she didn't believe me. She had the decency to let me not believe myself in private. Late June, the afternoon the rain came. It had been building since morning, a pressure change you could feel in your knees and your temples. The sky went from white to gray, to that bruised green-yellow color that means business. I was cutting back dead growth from the north border when the first drops fell. Heavy, immediate, no warm-up. Within 30 seconds, it was a downpour. I grabbed my tools and made it to the back porch, overhang, right as Nora came through the kitchen door. She was still in her scrubs, barefoot now, holding 2 mugs and looking at the sky like it had interrupted her. Good timing or bad timing, she said. Depends on the coffee. She handed me a mug. Black, no sugar. She'd figured it out somewhere around week 2 and hadn't gotten it wrong since. We stood under the overhang and watched the rain hit the new beds. The coneflowers bent and straightened, bent and straightened. Water ran off the stone wall in clean sheets. The yard looked alive in the rain, greener than it had any right to be. I moved here because I stopped sleeping, she said. I didn't say anything. Sometimes the best response to honesty is just staying still. In Philly, I was working 70-hour weeks at a multi-vet practice. Emergency surgeries at 2 in the morning. Back-to-back appointments until the light changed outside without me noticing. I'd get home, and my apartment would feel like a waiting room for a life I wasn't living. She wrapped both hands around the mug. And then Marcus and I split up. 2 years together. He wanted to get married, which should have been a good thing, but every time he brought it up, I felt this tightness in my chest, not butterflies, compression. Like I was being sealed into something. She paused. The IKEA argument was the last one. He wanted to pick out a couch together, which sounds small but felt enormous. I stood in the parking lot and said I can't do this, and he said, do what? And I said any of it. The rain was loud enough that silence between sentences felt natural, not empty, but full. She told me she'd found the listing for the clinic online at 3 in the morning, applied by 5, heard back by noon the next day. Drove down that weekend, walked the property, signed the lease. Her mother called it impulsive. Nora called it the first decision she'd made in years that felt like hers. That's not the boring version, I said. She looked at me sideways. No, but the boring version is easier at cocktail parties. The rain kept falling for another 20 or 30 minutes. We stood close enough that I could smell the clinic on her scrubs, antiseptic and something underneath, warm, human, tired. The overhang wasn't wide, and the wind pushed the rain sideways, occasionally, catching our shoulders. She asked me why I got into landscaping, and I told her the easy version. That I liked working outsides, and the money was decent if you ran your own crew. She listened, and nodded, and waited, the way she waited at the stone wall like she could tell. There was a second floor to the ancestor, and she was giving me the option. To take the stairs. I almost told her. The words were right there, that my father and I built that wall when I was 14, that he died when I was 29, that this was his garden, and I wasn't redesigning it so much as remembering it. Instead, I said, "Plus, you never have to wear a tie." She smiled. The rain eased. She went back inside, and I went back to the north border with wet boots and a pulse I couldn't steady. I didn't tell Danny about the phone call with my mother. Didn't tell him about the coffee or the rainstorm or the way Nora talked to Gerald like he was a colleague she mildly disagreed with. Danny would have listened and said nothing, and that would have been worse than him saying something, because Danny's silence was the kind that let you hear yourself. The last Thursday of June was hot, the kind of heat that sits on your shoulders like a hand pressing down. I was working near the base of the stone wall, clearing soil that had piled against the lower course over the years. The stones needed to breathe. Dirt packed too tight against dry stack walls holds moisture and breaks them from the inside. I was on my knees, pulling soil away from the base, and my hand found a familiar groove. A notch in the bottom stone, right side, about 8 inches from the ground. I stopped. I pushed the dirt away carefully, and there they were. 2 sets of initials carved into the fieldstone, with a flathead screwdriver on a Sunday afternoon 18 years ago. CM and DM, Caleb Marsh and David Marsh. My father carved them the day we finished the wall. He knelt right where I was kneeling, took a screwdriver from his back pocket, and said, "Every wall needs a signature." I watched him carve the letters slowly, each stroke deliberate. He handed me the screwdriver, and I carved mine below his, less steady. The M, slightly lopsided, because I was 14, and trying to match the precision of a man who'd been building things his whole life. I sat back on my heels. The heat pressed, and the yard was quiet. The initials were small, half hidden by soil and years, but clear enough if you knew to look. I didn't know Nora was watching from the kitchen window. The following Tuesday, she met me at the side gate. Not inside, not at the door, but at the gate itself, like she'd been waiting. "I found something near the wall," she said. "On the base stone, right side, initials carved into it, CM and DM." The yard was bright, and the air smelled like fresh mulch, and my hands went still at my sides, the way they had in the truck that first morning reading the address on my phone. She watched my face and then said it softly. "Caleb Marsh," not pitying, careful, the way you'd be careful with something you knew was fragile but didn't want to treat that way. "CM, that's you, isn't it?" I couldn't find the easy answer, or the deflection, or the joke. They'd all left the room. The gap where humor usually lived was just air, and in that air was the truth sitting plainly between us, like a stone that wouldn't balance on any wall I could build. "My father and I built that wall," I said, "the summer I was 14. DM is David Marsh, my dad." She didn't say I'm sorry. She didn't say I had no idea. She stood at the gate with her hands in the pockets of her scrub jacket and held still, the way she held still for Gerald, the way she held still when the rain came, patient and present, giving me the full weight of her attention without asking me to carry her reaction on top of my own. "You grew up here," she said. I nodded. "The yard, the wall, the soil you told me was good near the south fence." She was connecting the pieces. I could see it happening behind her eyes, weeks of small observations, rearranging into a picture she hadn't known she was assembling. The way I stopped at the wall, the way I'd said I'd keep it that first day, The That first day, like I was talking about something much older than fieldstone. Why didn't you tell me? I looked at the wall. The initials were hidden again, under the soil. I'd pushed back. I don't know, I said. And that was the most honest thing I'd told anyone in 3 years. She nodded once. She didn't push. She didn't ask follow-up questions or offer comfort, or try to make the moment smaller by filling it with words. She just stood there with me in the yard my father built. In the quiet, he would have understood, and let the truth sit where I'd put it. The conversation shifted after that, lighter. She asked about the bergamot, whether it needed more water. I said yes. We talked about the north border and the drainage near the back gate, normal things. But the frequency between us had changed. A door had opened, not wide, just enough to let light through. I left at 5 and packed my tools and closed the tailgate. Nora was inside. I could see her through the kitchen window, standing at the counter, Gerald on the windowsill beside her. I sat in the truck in the driveway, engine off, hands on the wheel. I told myself it was about the garden, that the weight in my chest was about the wall and the initials and the memory of my father kneeling in that exact spot with a screwdriver and steady hands. I knew it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. But I drove home anyway and stood in my kitchen and ate leftover pasta over the sink like a person who had everything under control. August arrived the way it always does. Not gradually. One morning in late July, the air changed, heavier, sweeter, the honeysuckle along her fence line going from polite to aggressive overnight. The garden was nearly finished. The east beds had filled in thick and bright, the coneflower standing taller than I'd expected, the bergamot spreading along the south border like it had been waiting years for someone to make room. The stone wall looked like it belonged now. Not a leftover from a different yard, but the center of this one. Creeping phlox along its base. Catmint on the east end. The moss on the top course catching morning light like green glass. I had maybe 2 weeks of legitimate work left. The drainage near the back gate needed attention, but not urgently. The north border could use another pass but would survive without it. The pavers were set. The fence line was clean. The yard breathed the way Nora wanted it to, open and alive, and full of things that would come back every spring without being asked. 2 weeks. Then the project was done, and I had no reason to park my truck on Bellwick Road on Tuesday mornings and Thursday afternoons. I started inventing problems. The drainage by the back gate, I told Nora one Thursday. I want to run a French drain along the base. Otherwise you'll get pooling in the fall when the leaves come down. She was sitting on the porch steps, with her coffee, bare feet on the warm stone, watching me the way she'd been watching me all summer. Patient, attentive, like she was reading a book she didn't want to rush through. How urgent is it? Could wait until October. But it's easier to trench while the ground's soft. She sipped her coffee. She looked at the yard. She looked back at me. Okay, she said, if you think it needs doing. The following Tuesday, I mentioned a second planting bed. The space along the west side of the property, between the fence and the walkway. It got good afternoon light. A mixed border of aster and goldenrod would extend the bloom season into October. She hadn't asked for a second bed. She'd never mentioned the West Side at all. But she nodded and said, "That sounds nice," and neither of us acknowledged what was happening, that I was building reasons to stay the way my father built walls. One stone at a time, each one chosen to support the next. The conversations had changed since the initials. Not the subjects, which were still coffee and Gerald and whatever animal emergency had marked Nora's day. The shape of them. They lasted longer. Silences sat between sentences like furniture in a room, comfortable, placed there on purpose. She started saving things to tell me. One Thursday she came home 20 minutes early and found me at the truck unloading soil amendments. "Okay, you have to hear this," she said. She dropped her bag on the porch and sat on the tailgate next to the bags of compost like it was a park bench. "A woman brought in a parrot today. Full exam, blood work, the whole thing. The parrot is fine, perfectly healthy. But the woman is convinced it's depressed because it stopped talking to her husband." She paused for timing the way a person does when they know the punchline. Turns out the husband has been sleeping on the couch for a month. The parrot isn't depressed. It just moved its loyalty. I laughed. She grinned. The late afternoon light was behind her, and her hair had come loose from the clip, the way it always did by 4 o'clock. And I stood there, holding a 40-pound bag of bone meal, like I'd forgotten what arms were for. She noticed. She always noticed. But she didn't say anything. She hopped off the tailgate and picked up her bag and said, "I found a plant at the nursery on Saturday, a Japanese forest grass. Golden, kind of weeping. I think it would look incredible at the base of the wall. Do you want to see it?" She'd gone to a nursery on her own weekend and thought about the wall. Not about what to plant near the wall. About the wall, specifically. She understood what it meant, and she was tending it without being asked, the way you'd water a plant in someone else's house because you could see it was thirsty. I said yes, I wanted to see it. She brought it out from beside the garage, a gallon pot of Hakanekloa, gold green and cascading, catching the light in a way that made the stone behind it look warmer. She set it on the ground near the base course and stepped back. "What do you think?" I looked at the grass. I looked at the wall. I looked at the spot where CM and DM were carved into the stone, hidden under soil and time. "It's perfect," I said, and I meant the grass. And I meant something else entirely. The following Tuesday, I pulled into the driveway, and there was a car I didn't recognize parked at the curb. Dark blue sedan, clean, a small sticker on the rear windshield from a dealership in Raleigh. Raleigh. I sat in the truck for a long moment. Then I got out and walked to the side gate and stopped. Because through the slats, I could hear 2 voices in the backyard. One was Nora's. The other was a voice I would have recognized anywhere, in any room, at any distance. My mother. She was standing near the stone wall, with a cardboard box tucked under one arm. She wore a blue linen blouse. And her reading glasses were pushed up on her head, the way they always were, when she was trying to look casual about something she'd thought about carefully. Nora stood beside her, with her arms crossed, not defensive. The comfortable way, the way she stood when she was listening closely. They hadn't seen me. My mother was holding a photograph. She tilted it toward Nora and pointed at something in the image and said, That's the summer he turned 14. He complained about the blisters for a week, but he never quit. Nora took the photo. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at the stone wall, at the real one, the one standing 10 feet away, with creeping flocks at its base and 18 years of weather in its joints. She pressed her hand to her mouth, just for a second. A small motion, quick, the kind of thing you do when understanding arrives all at once, and you need a moment before you trust yourself to speak. I stepped through the gate. My mother turned. She didn't startle. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me my entire life, with a steadiness that made lying to her feel like trying to hide something in an empty room. "Hi, sweetheart." I looked at the box under her arm. I looked at Nora. I looked at the photograph in Nora's hand. From where I stood, I could see it. A boy sitting on a half-built stone wall, skinny, sunburned, squinting at the camera. A man beside him with his arm resting on the top stone, smiling at the boy instead of the lens. My mother set the box on the porch steps. She told me she'd come to introduce herself to the new owner. Not to see me. She said it plainly, and I believed her, mostly because my mother did not lie, but she did occasionally arrange the truth in a convenient order. "I thought she should have these," my mother said, nodding at the box. "Photos of the house, the garden, your father's projects. They've been sitting in my closet in Raleigh for 3 years, and they belong here more than they belong with me." She stayed for 30 minutes. She walked the garden with Nora and pointed out where things used to be. The vegetable patch along the south fence, the herb bed my father kept by the kitchen door, the spot under the maple where they'd set up a folding table for summer dinners. Nora listened and asked questions, and my mother answered them, and I stood near the truck with my hands in my pockets and watched 2 women walk through my childhood, like it was a museum exhibit I hadn't agreed to open. My mother hugged Nora before she left. She hugged me in the driveway and said into my shoulder, "She's lovely, Caleb, and the garden looks exactly right." I didn't ask what she meant by exactly right. I already knew. Nora didn't mention the photos that evening. She didn't mention my mother's visit. We worked in the yard until the light changed, and she went inside, and I loaded my tools and left. Normal. Routine. 3 days later, I came through the side gate and walked to the mudroom door, where I always entered to connect the hose. The photo was hanging on the wall beside the door. She'd framed it. A simple black frame, clean, no matting. Just the photograph behind glass. The boy on the stone wall, the man beside him. 14 and 51. Summer light and steady hands. She'd hung it at eye level, exactly where I would see it, every time I walked through that door, which was every Tuesday and every Thursday, and had been for 4 months. I stood in the mudroom. I could hear Nora in the kitchen. The coffee maker was running, the pour-over kettle whistling the way it did right before she pulled it off the burner. Gerald was on the windowsill. Normal sounds. Normal morning. I couldn't move. The photograph held me the way certain things do. Not with force, but with recognition. That was my father's hand on the top stone. Those were my blisters. That was the summer before everything changed, and I was looking at it through glass in a house that used to be mine, hung by a woman who had never met my father, but who understood, somehow, what he'd left behind in this yard. Nora came to the doorway. She had 2 mugs. She saw where I was looking, and she stopped. She didn't say, "I thought you'd want to see it," or "I hope that's okay," or "Your mother gave me the photos, and I picked that one." She didn't explain. She didn't apologize. She stood in the doorway, with coffee in both hands, and waited. My throat was tight. My hands were at my sides. I was aware of the distance between us. 4 feet, maybe 5, and I was aware that the distance had been closing all summer. Conversation by conversation, silence by silence, and that this photograph on this wall was her way of saying she saw the whole of it. The garden, the wall, the grief. The reason I kept coming back. "Thank you," I said. She nodded. She handed me the coffee. We sat on the back porch for a long time. I held the mug and didn't drink. She sat beside me and didn't push. Then she said, "Tell me about the summer you built it." So I told her. Not the clean version. Not the version I'd given Danny once in 2 sentences, or mentioned to my mother in passing like it was a fact instead of a wound. I told her about the Saturday mornings, driving to the stone yard, in my father's truck, the radio tuned to a station that played songs I didn't know yet, but know by heart now. I told her about the blisters, and the way he taught me to set each stone by feel, finding the flat face with my thumb before I placed it. I told her about the afternoon we finished. How he stood back and looked at the wall for a long time without saying anything, and how I thought he was inspecting it for mistakes. But when he turned around, his eyes were wet and he said, "That's a good wall, Cal. That'll outlast both of us." I told her about the screwdriver, how he pulled it from his back pocket like he'd planned it all along, needs all along. Every wall needs a signature, the way the metal bit into the stone, slow and deliberate. The way he handed it to me, and I carved my initials below his with shaking hands because I wanted to match his precision and knew I couldn't. I told her about October. The weight loss, the appointments that multiplied, the way the yard started to look different. Not because anything changed, but because I was seeing it through a window from inside a house that had gotten quieter. If you've come this far into this story, you're the kind of person who belongs here. Hit subscribe for more like this. I told her about the last time I saw him in the yard. January. He was wearing a coat that was too big for him because he'd lost 40 pounds and refused to buy new clothes, because buying new clothes meant admitting a size he didn't plan to stay. He walked to the wall and put his hand on the top stone, the way you'd put your hand on a friend's shoulder. He stood there for maybe a minute. Then he came inside and sat in his chair and didn't go out again. I didn't tell her all of this in order. I didn't tell it like a story. I told it the way real people talk about grief. In fragments circling back, starting sentences that went somewhere I didn't expect and stopping in the middle of others, because the words ran out before the feeling did. Nora didn't interrupt. She didn't say, "I'm so sorry." She didn't touch my arm or offer comfort or try to fix what wasn't broken, just unfinished. She sat on the porch with her coffee going cold and her feet tucked under her, and she listened the way she listened to everything, fully, without agenda, giving me the entire weight of her attention like it was the easiest thing in the world. At one point, I stopped talking. Not because I was done, but because I needed air. The silence sat between us, warm and steady. She looked at the garden. "Your father had good taste in stone," she said. I almost laughed. Almost. The sound caught somewhere between my chest and my throat and came out as a breath instead. "He did," I said. More silence. Then she said, "I'm glad you didn't hand this job to Danny." She said Danny's name like she'd been carrying it for weeks. Like she'd figured out a long time ago that there was a Danny-shaped off-ramp I could have taken and didn't. And she'd been waiting to find out why. I looked at her. She looked at me. The garden was getting dark around us, the coneflower fading into silhouettes, the stone wall losing its edges. Fireflies had started in the far corner near the fence, 2 or 3 at first, then more, pulsing like slow heartbeats in the tall grass. "I wanted to come back," I said. She nodded, not surprised, not relieved. She nodded like she'd known it all summer and had been waiting for me to catch up. The garden was fully dark now. The porch light clicked on, a warm yellow that reached just far enough to light her face and the tops of the nearest plants. The coffee was long cold. Gerald appeared from somewhere and wound between the porch railings, bored with us, headed for the Hendersons. Nora stood up. She collected the mugs. She looked at me standing in her yard in the dark. In the garden, my father started and I couldn't finish, and she'd asked me to rebuild without knowing any of it. She said, "You know what I love about this garden?" I shook my head. Everything in it was here before I was. The soil, the wall, the roots. I didn't plant any of it. I just made room for what was already trying to grow. She went inside. The kitchen light came on. I heard water running, the clink of mugs in the sink. I sat on the porch steps. The stone was cool through my jeans. The yard was dark and quiet and full of things my father's hands had touched, and I stayed in the uncomfortable space of that, the grief and the gratitude, and the weight of having told someone the truth. And for the first time in 3 years, I didn't reach for my keys. I didn't drive home that night. I woke up on the couch. Not the way you fall asleep on a couch at a party, sideways, uncomfortable, half aware of the mistake. I'd slept deliberately. Nora had brought out a blanket and left it folded on the arm without a word. I don't remember pulling it over myself, but I must have, because the morning light was coming through the front windows, and the blanket was tucked around my shoulders, and the house smelled like coffee. Her house, my parents' house. The same rooms, different furniture, different light, different person moving through the kitchen, with bare feet on floorboards I used to know by sound. I sat up slowly. My neck was stiff and my boots were by the door. I didn't remember taking them off either. The kitchen was bright. Late morning, probably past 8. Nora was at the counter with the pour-over kettle, her back to me. She wore a gray sweatshirt too big for her, and her hair was down, longer than I realized, past her shoulders. Gerald sat on the windowsill, watching birds with the intense focus of a creature who had never caught anything in his life. She turned when she heard me. She had a mug in each hand. She looked at me standing in the doorway, creased and disoriented, and she didn't make it a moment. She just held one out. Morning. Morning. She turned back to the counter. No conversation about the night before, no debrief on what I'd told her, no gentle probing to see if I was okay. She poured coffee and pushed the sugar bowl aside because she knew I didn't use it, and she made space for me in her kitchen, the way she made space for everything. Quietly, without announcement, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard. I'd been in this house dozens of times now. Always through the side gate, always from the outside, in. Through the mudroom door to connect the hose, across the porch to sit with coffee. But I had never stood in this kitchen and looked out at the garden the way someone looks out at a yard they live in. The stone wall was there, lit by morning sun, the moss on the top course bright and wet from overnight dew. The coneflower stood in rows along the east bed. The bergamot had spread along the south border, purple and wild, the way good things spread when you stop controlling them. The maple threw a long shadow across the grass, and somewhere in that shadow was the patch of dark soil where my mother's vegetable garden used to be. From inside the house, looking out, the garden was something different entirely. Not a project or a site, but a view. The view my father had every morning for 26 years, standing at this window, coffee in hand, looking at the yard he'd built piece by piece over a lifetime of Saturdays. I was standing where he stood, seeing what he saw, and, for the first time, the thought didn't send me to my truck. Nora came and stood beside me. Not close, a respectful distance. She held her mug with both hands and looked at the garden with me. "What are you thinking?" I could have said nothing. Fine, just looking. Any of the exits I'd been using all summer, she would have let me take them. She always did. "I'm thinking this is the view he had," I said, "every morning, right here." She sipped her coffee and looked at the yard without responding. "It's a good view," she said. It was a good view. We stood there for a while. The kitchen was warm. Gerald dropped from the windowsill with a thud and wound between our ankles on his way to the door, bored with us, bored with the birds, bored with everything that didn't involve the Hendersons' cat food. Nora opened the back door for him and leaned against the frame. The air came in cool and green-smelling. That early fall crispness that means September is coming, whether you're ready or not. She said, "I've been thinking about the south fence." The south fence, where the soil was darker, where the rows ran east to west, because my father said tomatoes wanted morning sun. "What about it? I want to add something there. I'm not sure what yet." She paused. "Is there anything you'd want to put in that spot?" She said it carefully. Somewhere between a question and an offering, not casual and not heavy. She wasn't asking a landscaper for a recommendation. She was asking me what I wanted to keep. I looked at the south fence through the window. The soil was bare there, cleared and turned but unplanted. I'd left it that way on purpose. Every time I'd gotten close to planting it, my hands stopped. That patch belonged to my mother's tomatoes, to summer evenings, to the sound of her voice talking to plants like they were neighbors. I hadn't been able to put anything new there because new meant admitting the old was gone. "A vegetable patch," I said. I said it before. I thought about it. The words came from somewhere deeper than planning. Somewhere that had been holding the idea for months without permission. Nora looked at me. Like, what was there before? I nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't say that's beautiful or that's so meaningful. She just said, "Okay, tell me what goes in and I'll order the starts." That was the whole exchange. Two people standing in a kitchen, looking at a bare patch of soil, and agreeing it should become what it used to be. No grand gesture, no music, just coffee and morning light, and a woman who was sometimes the bravest thing you can say is what you actually want. I walked out to the yard after that and stood near the south fence for a long time. The soil was warm in the sun. I crouched and pressed my hand flat against it, the way you'd test a surface for heat, and the dirt was loose and dark and rich from years of my mother's compost, decades of vegetable roots breaking down and feeding the ground they grew from. Nothing had been planted there in 3 years. And the soil was still better than anything I worked with on other jobs. My mother would have said, "The ground remembers." My father would have said, "Good soil doesn't forget." I called my mother that afternoon. I'd driven home to shower and change and feed myself something that wasn't leftover pasta. I sat in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, and the late afternoon light slanting through a window that looked out on my own small yard, grassless, neglected, the yard of a person who'd been spending all his time in someone else's garden. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did, like she'd been holding the phone since the last time we talked. "Hey, Mom. Hey, sweetheart, you sound different." I told her about Nora. Not the coffee or Gerald or the rainstorm on the porch. I told her about staying. About standing at the kitchen window and seeing the yard the way Dad used to see it. About the photo she'd framed in the mudroom. My mother was quiet for a long time. Not the careful quiet from the first phone call, but a different quiet, full and unhurried. Then she said something that rearranged the air in the room. "Your father talked about that garden every day at the end. Not the house, not the money we needed for repairs, not his career or the projects he didn't finish. The garden, Caleb, every single day." I held the phone and didn't speak. He'd sit in that chair by the window and look at the yard and tell me what was coming in and what needed cutting back. Even when he couldn't walk out there anymore, even the last week. He'd look out and tell me the phlox needed water or the tomatoes were coming in late. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort underneath it, the careful architecture of a woman who had practiced saying these things alone in a condo in Raleigh for 3 years and was finally saying them to the one person who needed to hear them. He said the garden was where the family was, where you and he built the wall, where I grew the tomatoes, where we ate dinner in the summers. He said everything that mattered happened in that yard, and he was right. She paused. "He was right about that, Caleb." I sat there with my eyes burning and my hand gripping the phone so tight. My knuckles ached. My father at the window, looking at the garden he couldn't walk through anymore, talking about the wall, the tomatoes, the family. 3 years, and my mother had been holding that, carrying the weight of a dying man's love for a yard that his son couldn't bring himself to visit. I told her about the vegetable patch that Nora had asked, and I'd said yes. She laughed, a quiet breath that caught the light. "Of course," she asked, my mother said. "She's been waiting for you to say what you wanted." I didn't know if she meant Nora or the garden or both. It didn't matter. She was right either way. Autumn came, and the garden changed the way gardens do. Not dying, but settling. The coneflower dropped its petals and left brown seed heads, standing like sentinels in the east bed. The bergamot went gold along the south border. The maple turned slowly, green to yellow to that deep burnt orange that makes you stop and stand still for a second, because the color is too honest to look at and walk past. I stopped scheduling my visits on the work calendar. Danny noticed but didn't say anything, which was Danny's way of saying everything. He took over the Tuesday clients without being asked and forwarded me a parts invoice one afternoon, with a note at the bottom that said, "Tell Bellwick I said hey." I didn't submit a final invoice. Nora didn't ask for one. The professional boundary had dissolved weeks ago, quietly, the way morning fog lifts from a yard. One day it's there, and the next you look up, and the whole landscape is visible. I was at the stone wall on a Thursday in late October, not working, just standing there with one hand on the top course the way I always did, the way my father did in January of his last year. Nora came through the back door. She crossed the yard and stopped a few feet from me. "You're staring at that corner again," she said. I looked at her. She was smiling. Half a smile, the left side, the one she used when she was saying something that had a second floor. She'd said it the first day, too. That first walkthrough, standing beside a stone wall, she didn't know anything about. Watching a landscaper she'd just met stare at fieldstone like it owed him money. She'd said it then and she was saying it now. And the words were the same, but everything between them had changed. The first time, I'd laughed. Because the alternative was telling a stranger the truth. It was a good wall, I said. Present tense, not past. She stepped closer. Close enough that I could see the scar above her eyebrow. The one that only showed in certain light. Close enough that the space between us was just air, warm and thin. The kind of air that doesn't need filling. "It is," she said. She put her hand on the wall beside mine. Her fingers rested on the stone, pale against the gray, steady and sure. 2 hands on a wall that held 18 years of weather and silence, and the things we carry without knowing we're carrying them. The yard was quiet. The maple had dropped most of its leaves. The vegetable patch along the south fence had been planted 2 weeks ago. Late-season kale and garlic bulbs that would winter over and come up in spring, small green things in dark soil, patient and waiting. From the kitchen window, if you stood in the right spot, you could see the whole garden at once. The stone wall in the south corner, moss on top, phlox at the base, 2 sets of initials hidden in the bottom course. The maple in the center, with its circle of fallen leaves. The native beds along the fence lines settled into their first dormancy, roots deepening below the frost line where nobody could see them. The vegetable patch, new and small and full of things that wouldn't show themselves until April. I used to think grief required leaving, that the places where you lost someone had to be abandoned, sealed off, driven around, that the stone wall and the dark soil and the view from the kitchen window were things I had to protect myself from because they held too much of a person who wasn't coming back. But gardens don't work that way. Gardens take what was there before and grow something from it. The roots go deeper. The soil gets richer. The things that fall become the things that feed. My father built a wall and planted a tree and made a yard where his family gathered on summer evenings. And 3 years after he died, a woman moved into his house and asked his son to rebuild the garden. And his son said yes before he understood why. And somewhere in the middle of all that rebuilding, between the coffee and the rain and the initials in the stone, grief stopped being something he carried alone. It wasn't smaller and it wasn't gone, but it was shared, and sharing it made room for something his father would have wanted growing there. The garden sits in late autumn light, and the stone wall is still standing. The initials are still there, under the soil, under the phloxes, where the base course meets the ground. CM and DM. The M's are still lopsided because I was 14 and shaking, and trying to match a precision I hadn't earned yet. But now there's a vegetable patch again. Garlic bulbs wintering over and kale pushing through the cold. And there's someone inside the house who knows why that matters. What would you have done if grief led you back to the one place you'd been avoiding? Have you ever stayed somewhere you thought you needed to leave, and found it was exactly where you were supposed to be? Tell me in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.